Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Here at Recovering Evangelicals, we've done many episodes that simply ask someone to tell their story beginning firmly within a fundamentalist evangelical setting, but describing how and why they found they had to leave that form of Christianity. Some of them, years later, finding they had stopped at a simple agnosticism, not really knowing what to believe anymore or how to move forward. Others eventually found that they had arrived at an entirely different form of Christian faith. And yet others had come to the conclusion that there was nothing real or meaningful for them in Christian faith. I think there's value in hearing those stories. We can learn from each other, get answers or strategies, encouragement that we're not alone. I can't count how many times we've had people write in to say how valuable the podcast was for them, in part because they had previously thought their experience was unique, that they didn't know there were other people going through the exact same experiences, asking the same questions and dealing with the same emotions. We have a page at our website that collects together all those episodes, testimonials, I guess you'd call them, if you, the listener, want to check some of those out. The link for that webpage is in the show notes. All of those testimonials have aspects which all the rest of us can relate to. Going to school, getting a job, navigating the complexities of the 21st century Western zeitgeist, while at the same time going to church, reading the Bible, and encountering the same questions and tripping over the same hazards, dealing with the same anxieties of, what will my parents think, or what will my friends think? But at the same time, each story is unique. They all have their own unique perspectives on life. And while most of the rest of us walk this journey more or less internally and privately, some of those people did so in the public spotlight, where thousands of people were watching them. People like Frankie Schaefer in episode 114, and Philip Yancey in episode 113. Their fame and notoriety brought a whole other level of anxiety, confusion, and internal conflict. This week and next, we want to add 2 more testimonials to that growing list. 2 more people who also walk that same path that all of us are on, but the nature of their job, one a pastor and the other a professor, that added a whole new dimension of complexity and angst to their unique journeys. Today, we'll hear from the pastor. John James Kirkwood had been a pastor in the Chicago area for over 20 years, and for the first half of that, he was thoroughly a fundamentalist / evangelical, who then began to grow into a very vocal right-wing Christian nationalist, before a series of questions and books and conversations had him begin to chip away at all those beliefs. And now he finds himself still thoroughly a self-identified Christian, a Jesus follower, but with a completely new set of beliefs, and a number of ministries in Arizona. It was through 2 of those ministries, a podcast that addressed faith and science issues that he co-hosted with one of our listeners, Christine Johnson, a podcast called The Sparrow's Call, and also an online church called Church Without Walls that he hosted on his own. It was through those 2 podcasts that we came to know him, and we have him right here in our studio. John, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, gentlemen.
It's great to see you again. I know you from several venues, a couple podcasts, one of which is you're a YouTube pastor.
Yes. When I left my church in Chicago some 6 years ago, I stayed on as their interim pastor until they were able to fill the pulpit. And I began a YouTube pastorate. And it kind of turned into what I call Church Without Walls, which is something that welcomes not just believers, but people of any faith or no faith at all. It's part of the Sparrow's Call ministry that my wife and I started to really minister to the nuns, what is called the nuns and the duns, N-O-N-E-S, not the ones with the frock, but people who had been harmed by either the church or the faith, or doubt has pushed them out onto the same journey that kind of I went on. And so Church Without Walls is on hiatus right now, but it will circle back eventually. Yeah.
Okay. And our listeners can't see you. This is an audio podcast, but I can see you here. And I've often thought when I have watched your podcast, you look like you were an ex-motorcycle gang member. Do you have people saying that?
My wife always said that I should have had a prison ministry. And at sometimes in my life, that could have been from which side of the bars I was on. But yeah, I did have kind of a checkered past in my youth. And I don't have a motorcycle now, but I did partake back in the day.
Well, I wasn't getting at what you did or how you were. I just mean you have this appearance. You're a big guy. You look
Hmm.
intimidating. You've got tattoos all over the place.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
you've
True.
got the Walter White look back in his Heigenhauser
Ah,
days.
yes. Yes. One of my favorite characters, actually, but not, I don't want to emulate him. No. But yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah.
Okay, so John, as I've just told our listeners, we wanted to hear your life story, your journey on the same path that we have all been on, from evangelical fundamentalist Christianity to
Hmm.
something very, very different. But you have a unique angle on this, you being a pastor.
Hmm.
We're going to hear about that in a few minutes. What I first want to do is I'll ask the guests to talk about the Christianity they had when they were a child, the Christianity
Hmm.
that their parents introduced them to and they were raised in. And the reason I do that is because I've heard this term spiritual formation. When you grow up as a child in that, it forms you, it gets your brain wired in a certain way. And so tell us about the Christianity of your childhood.
Yes, it was changing as well because my father was going through, we didn't call it deconstruction, but he went through changes in his life. He was an atheist. As a young man, he got saved at a Billy Graham crusade that his sister brought him to. And he left Connecticut for California, stopped in Chicago to get some gas money for his motorcycle, and fell in love with my mother at a place called the Pacific Garden Mission. Now, whenever I tell the story, people think that my father was being ministered to on Skid Row, but no, he actually stopped to work there to get some money, gas money, and he fell in love with the secretary, Mary Lachin, and they got married. Now, my father, when he was saved as a young man, was a Pentecostal. It was a Pentecostal church that he went to. He had questions, and the answers that he was getting didn't seem to jive with reality, and he moved on from that into kind of a Baptist background, and that's what I was born into, a very conservative Baptist background. It was rather strict. I was born in 1967, and it's funny how apologists suggest that things don't change in Christianity, and things like sin and moral absolutes. But sin definitely changed in my life because in the Baptist church I went to, women weren't allowed to wear pantsuits until the pastor's wife was gifted thousands of dollars worth of pantsuits from an executive businesswoman in the church, and all of a sudden that became less of a sin. Um, but growing up in that movement, I remember we couldn't listen to rock and roll. It was that kind of Baptist things. And my eldest brother, Nate, still I regard this very highly, would sneak in Beatles albums. And
Mm.
that was my introduction to rock and roll is contraband. When my parents would go out for visitation, we'd break out the Beatles albums and enjoy some music. My dad eventually grew away from that and moved into kind of a non-denominational, dispensational background, and he became a pastor himself. So
And some
I
listeners will need to know what dispensational means.
yeah, so dispensationalism, and now I look back on all the isms, and I think they're systems built to try to make sense of the Bible or to
Mm.
try to make the Bible univocal, whether it's Calvinism or creationism or dispensationalism. But dispensationalism is the idea that, of course, God never changes, but his methods with men do in time. And so the Jew of the Old Testament period would have to throw a lamb over his shoulder and take it to sacrifice, but we don't do that today. And that's all because of dispensationalism that was done away with. And they've got very complicated graphs and flowcharts to show you all the changes. And so, yes, so the idea that the church is different from Israel is a very dispensational idea, and that the church started at a particular time. Now, dispensationalists argue about this. There's no two dispensationalists who think alike. So, did the church start in Acts 2 or Acts 9 or Acts 20? And there's some have it starting in the Gospel of John. But dispensationalism basically carves up the Bible to make it more understandable and to try and force it into a univocal kind of, if God didn't dictate this, he certainly edited it so it's perfect.
Right.
And there's, as you can imagine, contradictions you run into there. But
And
yeah.
your church would have been a very fundamentalist church, or your
I would
upbringing
say
was very
the
fundamentalist.
dispensationalist church, I would say would lean more evangelical, but we would have called it evangelical. But I see why you would categorize it as fundamentalist. Now, by the time I was graduated into dispensationalism, my father was no longer kind of a legalist, the Baptist legalist thing. So we could listen to rock and roll. We could, it differs depending on where you are in the United States. But I think there were five major sins, playing cards, dancing, mixed bathing, and
Mm.
going to the theater, that kind of thing. Although my wife reminds me that I did get in trouble once because somebody from the church saw me going to the Pickwick Theater in Park Ridge to see Don Knotts in the Apple Dumpling Gang as an eighth grader. And somebody called my mom like I had gone into a pornographic theater because that was, a
Yeah.
no-no in my background. Yeah.
I remember from my own early days in the Pentecostal circles in my teen years and working at the summer camp, and there was that idea that if Jesus came back and you were in a theater,
Mm.
he came back for the rapture, you would be left behind because you were
Yeah.
simply because you were in the theater.
And
Yeah.
somewhere between that theater and the television, God must have consecrated these movies because they were okay on television, but not okay in the theater. So,
These things that you're saying resonate with me as well. It's just funny to hear these shared experiences, and I totally agree that it's interesting that even a church today, at least here in Canada, like a typical, like say Baptist church here, they would say it's not progressive, quote, progressive,
mhm.
is still, if you look from the last 20 or 30 years, way more progressive than the movement that I entered 30
Sure.
years or so ago.
Yeah.
They wouldn't even recognize each other. Drinking now is quite accepted within most evangelical churches. That was a
Mhm.
huge issue so even those who wouldn't call themselves progressive, they may not realize it, but things have shifted quite a bit
Oh,
with
sure.
it.
Yeah. In the Baptist church I grew up in as a young man, we didn't even go to a restaurant that served alcohol. So even if,
Ah,
we didn't want to be caught in a restaurant that even served alcohol. But the way that the church has changed its mind on divorce as well over the years, in my
yes,
early years, that
Right.
was really a scarlet letter.
right.
So, John, that's your world when you were a child. What about the teen and college years, which eventually led you into the ministry? What happened in your teen and college years that pointed you in that direction?
So I did go into the far country as a prodigal son for a while. And I kind of left the church for a period of time after I graduated high school and floundered for a bit until I lost a friend to a car accident.
Mm.
And I was standing in front of his casket at the funeral, and there was so much despair in the room. And that moment really changed me and brought me back into the church and made me more serious because I felt, I had sat with this guy at a neighboring bar stool probably dozens of times, and all we talked about was motorcycles and women and football. And I didn't make a difference in his life, was my thinking at the time. And I don't want to continue on with that. So that really gave me kind of a wake up call. And I came back into the church and I began to teach Sunday school to start with. Eventually, I began to teach an adult Bible study much later. And then my father had a heart attack, and he was out of commission for almost a year in recovery. And they asked me to fill the pulpit, and I was horrified. And then I grew a liking to it, when I finally found my own voice. At first I tried to be Ravi Zacharias, and then I tried to be Jim
Mm.
Kirkwood, my father. And then I realized I just have to be myself. And it's when I finally got there, my father recovered and came back for a few years before he retired. And once he retired, then the church ended up calling me in kind of a Nepo fashion, calling me out of the business world and into the ministry. And I never planned on being a pastor, but that's kind of how that all transpired.
So not Bible college.
I want to say spared that, but I know, Scott, you went to, we used to call it cemetery. And this is one of those ideas in the movement that we were in that was skeptical of expertise and higher learning. My father himself had graduated as a valedictorian of his Bible college. And yet, in our movement, in the non-denominational movement, it was kind of considered, that's where you go to for your faith to die. It
Yeah.
really was derided in our world, even though my father had done that. So, yeah, it was kind of surprising to say that, but no, they didn't feel I did. I was going to take some Greek at Moody Bible Institute. And when I was of age to do that, they still had a rule, and you're going to laugh because you've got me pegged as Walter White. But back then I had shoulder length hair, and Moody didn't allow that. And so I never pursued that. But no, I did not, didn't go to Bible college or seminary. No.
Okay, so then you said you were called away to a church elsewhere. Is this the church in Chicago?
So in Bensonville, just west of O'Hare Airport. So Chicago suburb. Yeah.
Okay. And you were there 20 years. That's a big part of your story. So why don't you tell us about that?
So I became, and I say became, a Christian nationalist over time. And I mentioned Ravi Zacharias. I think looking back on myself, I wanted to, the two men I admired most, and they don't make sense, but would have been Rush Limbaugh and Ravi Zacharias. And
Wow.
a mixture of those two fellas is something that I wanted to be. And I did have a radio show in the Chicago area, and I wrote a conservative column, very conservative column that spoke to my political leanings. But my radio show was Christian kind of apologetics. And over time, I grew more and more into the Christian nationalist kind of way of thinking, so much so that, and you guys are going to grimace or laugh or roll your eyes at this, but I remember reacting a lot to what we saw in the culture. And so, you couldn't go to Target, because they didn't say Merry Christmas at Target, and you couldn't really buy Ben and Jerry's ice cream and enjoy it. Maybe you do that on the sly, but we were all in on boycotts and all in on the, trying to use the Christian dollar in the way it should be used. And that grew and grew more fervent. So much so when a kid down here in the United States got suspended from his like fourth or fifth grade class because he had a Pop-Tart that he bit in the shape of a handgun. We responded at our church and we had a Second Amendment Sunday because we believed in all of the Ten Commandments, especially the first one, thou shalt not have any other gods aside from me. And of course, the second one, which you have the right to bear arms and that shall not be infringed. So, yeah, we became kind of a very reactionary church. I thought this was an outgrowth of the faith. I really didn't think how you could be a Democrat and be a Christian because we were very pro-life and pro-family. And a lot of that was really our understanding of the Bible and what the Bible meant to communicate. Of course, to us, the United States was New Israel, kind of, a
Right.
projection of Israel in modern times. And so that whole thing was part of it. That began to change when Donald Trump ran for president. And believe it or not, when he first arrived on the scene, my first two columns were favorable to Donald Trump. I didn't see him as a reasonable candidate, but I loved the fact that he was punching the guys in the nose that I wanted to see punched in the nose, like Jeb Bush and others that we considered not real Republicans, Republicans in name only. And I loved the bull in the China shop. And then when he gained momentum, I was a Ted Cruz guy because he's a good Christian and he understands the Constitution. And when Trump kept gaining momentum, I think I became more and more shocked at my peers and companions and colleagues in the pro-life movement and in the pro-family movement who were buying into it. Particularly, there was one weekend where he had faith leaders out to New York, out to Trump Tower, New York. And to me, it seemed like he bought them. He bought those voices because they were against Trump when they went there. And like a light switch, after they came back, they were all in. And that troubled me because everything I had learned and taught in the Bible about being humble and not being a bully. And his very demeanor troubled me. I don't know if you guys remember up in Canada, he mocked a New York Times reporter once for having a palsied hand. And everything about him was offensive to me. And I wasn't the kind of guy who just, waved off the indiscretions just because you were wearing the team jersey. One of the things that really offended me when I was a young earth creationist was the way Ken Ham expressed himself. And I thought he was a horrible spokesperson and annoying. And to me, now I look back at it and I see how he prepared Christians for somebody like Trump with his nasty demeanor and so forth. So when Trump came along, he really startled me. And the fact that so many Christians were following him startled me. And it made me pause and ask myself the dangerous question, what if I'm wrong? And that was the journey that I went out. Now, there was somebody else involved in this. Luke, you've heard me say before that there are two men that were instrumental in what people call deconstruction, but to me, it feels like, as you said in one of your earlier episodes, exiting Plato's cave. And it's Roger Goodell, who was the commissioner of the NFL, and it was Donald Trump, in that order. So being a Christian nationalist, when Roger Goodell punished North Carolina because of their bathroom bill, and removed some NFL events from North Carolina, I said, that's it. I'm not watching football anymore. I'm giving it up. My conscience won't allow me to waste time anymore watching football. And I was a football addict. Every game, I'd listen to sports radio. I kept up with it. Football was my passion. And I gave up football, and then I had all this time. And I said to myself, I want to be the greatest apologist out there, not because I wanted fame, but because I wanted to be able to answer questions correctly. And so I started to do a deep dive in certain areas, one of them being creation evolution, and one of them being how we got our Bible. And those two avenues, I spent hundreds of hours studying, multiple books, watching debates. And I remember Bart Ehrman, I remember all the people that were supposed to be the boogeymen that you were supposed to watch out for and not read. And I said, well, my father taught me to think critically and to read what the enemy's saying so you could counter their argument. And so I began to read even these guys. And so I went to YouTube and I said, I want to watch these debates with Bart Ehrman and see him get it handed to him by these conservative scholars. And each debate I watched was crushing for me because they didn't hold up well. And even worse, they weren't steel manning what he was saying. They weren't behaving in what I would call an ethical manner for a Christian. And Bart was just destroying them left and right, except for maybe Dan Wallace. I think Dan is a good gentleman. He held his own. But even in the Dan Wallace debate, Dan admitted that Bart was right on his observations. He just didn't agree with his conclusions. So these two adventures were stunning to me. I had never met a Christian who accepted evolution. And then I bought The Language of God by Francis Collins. And I remember my wife was sitting on the couch with me, and I got to the chapter about the chimpanzee genome and how close it is to ours. and the fused chromosomes. And I remember I shut the book and my wife looked at me because it was kind of an exclamation point. And I said, honey, the evidence is overwhelming. I can't believe I've been wrong all this time. We've been wrong about this. A couple weeks later, I invited my boys who were in high school at the time into the living room and I apologized to them about it. And I said, I don't want you just to think the way I do now, but I want you to be aware that there are a lot of Christians around the world who accept this. And so that was the first real totem to fall in my house of cards, if you will. The second one, after The Language of God and a book called Origins, written by the Harzmas. If The Language of God stunned me, in a boxing term, my feet got wobbly, Origins knocked me flat. And by the end of Origins, I had become convinced that Christians owed Darwin an apology, and there's going to be a long line in heaven, maybe, waiting to apologize to Darwin for how we've treated him and how we've treated evolution, and even the astronomers. But then I did a deep dive into how we got our Bible, and I think that was the biggest one. And I still say today, I meet a lot of scientists. I have a lot of friends in that world. And while they understand the difference between the science and the faith, they still stumble with things like inerrancy and infallibility and that kind of thing. And maybe we talk about that later, but that was the bigger blow when I realized that God didn't write the Bible, that men had a bigger hand in it. And really the thing that really I didn't understand until I studied it is that the Bible isn't a book, as your guest recently said. And I think he said it's a library,
A
but
library, yeah.
it's not technically even a library. It's dozen libraries, right? Because there are different Bibles, and the Coptic Bible is different than the Douay-Rheims. And actually, the 1611 King James is different than the modern King James because that one had the Apocrypha. So, yeah, we're talking about libraries when it comes to the Bible. And so that one was, I think, big in my transformation because I realized that not everything in the Bible, I think you brought it up recently, Luke, the bashing of the Babylonian babies' heads and so forth. And there's so much in the Bible that I don't see in Jesus. And so to make it all work, coming from my dispensational framework, I was always skeptical of that. Because some of it, you kind of winked and nodded and you just didn't want to talk about it too long because it did seem like a contradiction. It did seem like this whole idea with Ken Ham's ark being a testament somehow to God's love, I can't think of a worse event in biblical history to point to if you want to tell the world that God loves you after he's just drowned everyone in it. So my last 3 years of ministry, to answer your question, I completely changed. And I devoted those last 3 years to simply speaking of the love of Christ and focused around that. And believe it or not, it was controversial in my church. I wanted to see if I could.
You talking about the love of Christ was controversial.
Yeah, they wanted the culture warrior action figure. And all of a sudden, I was more of a Jesus freak. And eventually, Wendy said to me, John, this isn't the pastor they hired, and they're not coming along with you. We had people leave the church because of the columns I wrote outside the church that were negative about Donald Trump. We had people leave the church over that. And then that's not even to mention, I taught an apologetics class on Thursday nights where I did introduce some of the things that I had learned and was now transformed about, like the concept of eternal conscious torment. I challenged your favorite atonement theory, Luke, is I challenged that one night, and so that became controversial. And I think of what Russell Moore said, that he's had a number of pastors come up to him who were simply quoting Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, and people came up to him angry afterwards, saying, where did you get that? In defense of Trump, who was never mentioned, they don't. The modern evangelical, I know it's different in Canada, but the modern evangelical down here is closer to Machiavelli and Nietzsche than they are to Jesus of Nazareth. And it pains me to say that. But that's, I think, one of the reasons so many children are leaving the faith and walking away as nuns and duns. As I started the Sparrows Call, the original goal was to let them know, no, don't walk away from the church. Don't allow the older brother in the field to put you off of the Father's table. There's a seat here at the Father's table. Please come in. He's slain the fatted calf. And as I walked with the nuns and duns more and listened to their stories, I realized that they were leaving a toxic environment where they didn't really felt seen or heard.
So you described your journey out of your faith. It sounds very similar to many of our listeners, and for that matter, to Scott's and my own, where you're reading books. You mentioned Francis Collins and the Harmsmas, and Bart Ehrman for that matter, and you're thinking your way through these things, and your faith changes in the process. That's something that we can all relate to. But at the same time, you were leading a church. And I'm wondering to what extent that was affecting your journey. Was that holding you back? Were you being forced to hold on to ideas that you didn't really embrace, but you kind of had to?
So I'm not the personality. That's why I'm no longer behind a pulpit right now. I'm not the personality that goes along to get along or that just can sleep at night just to collect a check. I couldn't do that. There are things, even before I transformed, that I didn't teach on from the pulpit because I wasn't comfortable with. So I would avoid those subjects. One of them, believe it or not, was dispensational truth when it came to like their outlines and so forth, and the rapture and the end times. I wasn't comfortable with that, so I never taught that. And people would always ask for that because in that movement, prophecy is a big deal. They want to hear prophecy. My father used to say this to me in private. He used to say it's a shame, but a lot of people in our movement care more about the coming of the Antichrist than they do about the return of Christ. And, and there is some truth to that, in that there's this, and they, by the way, they divine every headline, down here. If Trump would have lost, we would have been closer to the rapture, but he won. So, with evangelicals, so that might be, we might have received a reprieve, but everything, from tornadoes and, that's all in the end times, it's all, you can find it in Revelation and Ezekiel and so forth. And so they interpret it through that. And so there were things I didn't feel comfortable teaching and I wouldn't teach. I only really would teach what I was comfortable teaching. That doesn't mean I didn't get questions about those things. That doesn't mean there weren't controversies. And like I said, people would leave the church. I remember one time it started to take a toll when I came home after a Sunday and I found my wife and daughter crying in the living room. And I said, what happened? And a family had left the church because that Sunday I had mentioned that maybe God didn't start the church in Acts 9 because, Acts 8 mentions Paul was wreaking havoc in the church. So maybe it started earlier than that. And that was enough to get a family to leave the church. And that family, my daughter's best friend was in that family, and the wife of that family that left was very close with my wife. And it was just crazy things like that. But as I was changing, I focused on the love of Christ. Some people didn't notice, some people noticed. And there are gatekeepers in that movement. When you're leaving Plato's cave, in Christianity, we don't call them gatekeepers, right? I mean, looking back at it now, I call them gatekeepers, but they would call themselves watchmen on the wall, right? Mm-hmm. So to them, they're protecting the city of God, and they've got their shofar, and they're ready to blow it when they see evil on the horizon. And evil on the horizon in my last 3 years is when I would quote somebody who they'd consider a liberal Christian and not one of the approved. And then I'd hear about it afterwards. Someone would come up and say, this person, they don't rightly divide. They're not one of us. And you quoted them. I would quote a Catholic or a Pope even, and I'd get pushback from not all, but some. The watchmen. The watchman would start to poke and prod, and it built in momentum. But most of that, I really think, was my criticism of Donald Trump, because in the pulpit, I wouldn't mention him by name, but I'd criticize behavior using scripture. And I wouldn't plan on it. I speak off the cuff. It would just come up, and I throw a little barb in here and there. But I did write a conservative column. And so each week people would read my column, and they'd get angry at something I wrote outside of the church. And I remember having meeting after meeting with people, why are you doing this? So it was a challenging 3 years. But I'll say this to you, Luke, and this is not a criticism of people. Church for some people is kind of like the old Elks Club or something. It is a social event, and all they really care about is our church was very focused on the spoken word. And so I'd do 45 minutes, and then we'd take a half-hour coffee break, and then I'd do another 45 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And they kind of built on each other. Some people just came for that half-hour break because they wanted to meet their friends and drink their coffee. And I could have been saying anything from the pulpit, and they wouldn't have known. It wouldn't have metabolized in any direction or so. But it was difficult. And for me, it was sad because I really tried to get people to think more critically about in the dispensational movement, there's this passage in Acts that talks about how the Bereans are more honorable than everyone else. And so there's a lot of dispensational churches or ministries that have Berean in it because, of course, we're more honorable than the rest of y'all's. And why were they more honorable? Because they searched the scriptures to see if this was correct. And so I tried to play on the Berean aspect and get people to do that, but it didn't really go over well. One of my favorite comedians encapsulates this perfectly. She's a young woman who's a nun now. She left a background very similar to all of ours. And in her stand-up routine, she starts talking about when she had doubt. And she says, the Christian church doesn't like doubt. They treat it as a sin. And she said sin in a room full of, Friday night people who are drinking martinis. And she said, she realized they don't know what sin is. And she says, you don't know what sin is. Let me help you with the sin hierarchy. Right here is murder. And just above murder is premarital sex. And just above premarital sex is gay sex. And above gay sex is premarital gay sex. And then the worst of all sins is critical thinking. So basically, I really resonated with that because I found that to be true with a lot of people in the cave. They said they thought for themselves. They said they searched the scriptures. When I had asked them something about it, they'd quote one of the watchmen on the wall or something. Or they dismiss people. Like just recently, one of my wife's family members was sent an article claiming Francis Collins is, basically possessed by demons. And this is why, And so if you quote an article from NPR or the New York Times or anything but Fox News, it's not real. It's not real. And if you go outside of the dispensational approved writings, you can't trust it.
When you get engaged with people on the issue of Trump, for example, how did they justify supporting Trump, knowing full well, the issues?
In the absolute worst way, Trump as Cyrus or Trump as King David.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Yeah, Trump is King David, and David wasn't perfect. No man is perfect. And then they clung to the idea that he's a new Christian, so give him room, give him space. He's got to grow. And it really was insulting. But they have nowhere else to go. I mean, you really can't defend the behavior. You
No.
can't, and even some of the policies, but the behavior especially when our movement, the Christian Nationalist movement, really clutched our pearls during the Bill Clinton administration because of, his affair in the White House and all that. I mean, Bill Clinton was the worst person in the world, and all of a sudden there's a guy that makes Bill Clinton look like, Billy Graham. And how do you answer that? I mean, we've got quotes of Franklin Graham and these other guys saying horrible things about Bill Clinton, and it pales in comparison. And now they're making excuses for their guy. And when Bill Clinton, I at the time criticized National Organization of Women for defending Bill Clinton. I said, they're only doing this because he's pro-choice, because obviously he's had these affairs, he's mistreated women. If anyone should not be celebrating him, it's the National Organization of Women, only to turn around and see evangelicals do the same thing with Donald Trump. He's got the get out of jail free card because he's promised to endorse conservative judges who will overturn Roe, and that's all they cared about. And that's it. And so, yeah, they would try and defend him as being King David. He's King David. Well, David had indiscretions, but he was a man after God's own heart, and God has raised him up. And yeah.
I remember thinking at the time they'd elect Satan if he said he was going to overturn Roe v. Wade, you know?
I had the same thought, Scott. And it was, and it's sad, but there's truth to that. But... Yeah.
Okay, so we definitely want to hear about your post-Chicago days, because that's where you're at now. So what had you leaving Chicago? Did they run you out of town?
They didn't. It was a number of reasons. Wendy had convinced me that my tenure was going to be short there. I was just going to, she knows me. So she knows I wasn't going to play some kind of game and hide who I was or what I believe. And she knew that it wouldn't be accepted well in that church. And so one day I came home and both my sons had decided on Arizona for school. And jokingly, I wasn't serious, but jokingly, I said to my wife, let's go. And seriously, she said, can we?
Oh.
And I said, oh. And then I started to take inventory on what I was doing to my family to keep this up. And I said, I've got to do something different, not only to be honest with the church, but to spare my family this. And then I said to my sons, would you mind if we follow you out there to Arizona? Because I didn't want to hover, and neither of them minded. And so then at the age of 52, which is kind of scary. And Luke, I think you alluded to this in your question, at least it might have been implied. I have pastor friends who are trapped. And they do feel trapped, and they have been to seminary, and all they know is what they're doing. And they feel helpless and hopeless almost. So I do think about them in a lot of ways, and it would be scary. I had business skills from before I went into the pastorate, and I leaned on those coming out. I still wanted to have a ministry, and it was a ministry I didn't have to worry about having a majority of my parishioners vote me out, because it was going to be a ministry for those who are walking, who are questioning, who do have doubts, and I wanted to walk with them. And when I first started to change, Luke, and I became familiar with BioLogos, there's a young man who worked in the offices at BioLogos. He was a pastor's son. And he went away to college, and his best friend, who went to the church, went away to college, and they both were in STEM. They both studied science, and they came back, and he was stunned to find out that his best friend had now become an atheist. So he goes to talk to him, and he said, what happened? We both followed the same path. We're both in science. And he said to him, well, I learned that in science, asking questions was important and even celebrated. But in church, asking questions makes you a troublemaker, or they hang a scarlet letter around you, or they're skeptical of you. And it's hard to argue against that, because I've seen it happen over and over, where there's not that room for asking a difficult question. But
so what you're saying, John, reminds me of an episode we did a while back. I'll have to find the episode number to tell the listeners. But it was an episode in which we referred to the evangelical faith like a crystalline figure. This thing that was beautiful, but it was brittle. It was hard and brittle. And when you knocked it on the rock, it would just shatter. And that's the thing about evangelical faith, it seems. We've all been on this path where we just simply begin to ask questions and read books. And we find the same stopping points, the same tripping hazards, and evangelical faith always seems to break. It just shatters. And I remember back in the day before I started going down that slippery slope, we would point to other people who had been on that path, and basically we saw it as a pathology. It was something that was wrong in their lives. But now I see that there's something intrinsic about the evangelical faith that makes it susceptible to just simply asking questions and reading books. Any comments on that, John?
I think you're exactly right. The opening of your show, talking about how the 21st century interfered, there is so much truth to that. And you're mentioning books, but I would also say, I think YouTube, when we were growing up and that wasn't available, yeah, if John MacArthur said something from his pulpit, that was it. I mean, that's all you heard if you were going to that church. You never heard it challenged by other people and shared, and a point or a counterpoint as you can now. And some of the greatest minds in the world are available, on our phone. And so we might not be able to sit under them at Princeton or hear their speech overseas, but we can hear it, and we can hear it instantaneously. And this was, I think, big in my development, because some of my heroes, I would go and watch them make their points, and then I'd see the argument against it by not necessarily people, atheists or people not in the faith, but other people in the faith even, and see how that really lacked substance, that argument. And it's almost like going from, when we only had 3 channels on the TV to having more. It's like what Twain says about travel. Travel is kind of a death knell to prejudice, because you're going to meet other people that think differently and pray differently, and they're people, and they're not scary, and they're kind, and they love their children and so forth. So I do agree with you. Books are a help. I remember reading when I was wrestling with evolution and creation, and I read the book. It was the 4 views or the 5 views or whatever that Erdman's put out, and I thought that was very valuable. And then about inerrancy, I read that book, The 5 Views of Inerrancy, and those are very helpful to hear multiple voices. But to find out that there are other Christians who don't think like you, it was really something for me, I know. Because I wouldn't have listened to Richard Dawkins about evolution. I would have just dismissed him. It's Richard Dawkins. He hates God and Christ and the Bible and Christians. Why would I listen to him?
Right.
I had to listen to Francis Collins. And one of the reasons I listened to Francis Collins is we had something in common. We both loved C.S. Lewis. And so I found out that he was kind of led to the Lord through the writings of Lewis. And Lewis is one of my heroes. And I said, I got to read this guy. And the first half of his book is kind of his testimony. And the second half, he gets into the science. And I was already his friend. He was a friend of mine in the first half of the book. And I couldn't wait to finish it. And then so I do think you're right. But as a pastor, there is extra baggage, and it's not just financial. When you leave Plato's cave, when you leave that environment, it comes with a cost. Oftentimes you will lose financial stability. Oftentimes you'll lose lifelong friendships, and there will be estrangement within families, and you'll be derided behind your back and to your face. But there's also a shame that comes attached to it when you were a spokesperson for that movement. You're less of a victim. You're kind of a camp guard, right? And I have blood on my hands. And so for me, the transformation was those last 3 years, I was walking up these steps to the attic. And when I got to the top of the attic, I opened the door and I saw the picture of Dorian Gray. I saw how ugly I had been. And that was really troubling to me, and still is. And so in a way, I carry that. And the only way to dispense with shame, they say, is to share it and to talk about it. But I do have a great sense of shame that I was a leader in that movement, and that I led people with what I thought was truth, but was misinformation or bad information. And, there are other areas, obviously, how I think about the LGBTQ movement. And a lot of that fell to the side. You talk about the evangelical faith being something beautiful, but very fragile. When I realized that the Bible might be inspired of God, but it wasn't written and edited by God, and I could actually disagree with some of it, then
Mhm.
I began to ask myself, okay, well, what if the writer here in one of the clobber passages was expressing something from their culture and their day and not something that God would approve? What if this is just like
Mm.
the Babylonian crushed skulls thing that would please no God that's worthy of worship? And so those questions free you to being open to other things. And I think that was the biggest step for me. Now, a lot of people who walk our journey end up being triggered by the Bible, and they'll set it aside and never return to it. And I don't. I love the Bible. I think I can appreciate it even more now, but I understand that because people in my own family feel that way. I understand that it's a trigger, but I look at the Bible now as just a collection of, holy writings, and some of them are amazing. I did a wedding in Houston a couple weeks ago, and I did read from the love passage in 1 Corinthians 13. Not my choice, it was the bride's. But that's wonderful. There are passages in Scripture, Philippians, to think on these things, and in Romans 8 about God's love being surpassing. There are passages that are the highest of human intellect, if you want to say, and they are divinely inspired. And yet I don't carry the weight of it being infallible or inerrant. One of my Church Without Walls that I did recently, I mentioned that Paul was wrong. And most scholars know this, that Paul's understanding that a woman should cover her head because angels might get too hot and bothered was a Greek understanding of a woman's hair being part of the sexual organs of the day. And that's clearly not divinely inspired. We know better these days. But I did that, and somebody texted me, "Did you just disagree with Paul?" And in my old world, you couldn't disagree with Paul. And in the new world, I feel compelled to in some cases. And that might not have been Paul. I know that was in one of the letters that's disputed, but
If I can bring us back about 5 minutes in our conversation, John, you were talking about the difficulties it is to walk this path as a pastor, and you brought up the economic argument. I get it. That's a very significant thing for somebody to do, the whole question of losing your income, your revenue. But I was also getting at the idea of the difficulty faced by a pastor in that you start from an evangelical fundamentalist belief yourself, and as a pastor, you're leading a congregation who's evangelical and fundamentalist, but then you begin to change and you begin to drop a lot of those evangelical and fundamentalist beliefs. But the people don't. A lot of them are still, they embrace that. And you have to somehow navigate your own deconstruction while leading them, keeping
yeah.
them in their way of thinking. That's got to be difficult.
It was difficult, and especially because I had mentioned two areas for you guys, the science area, creation science and evolution, but also my understanding of what the Bible was and how it wasn't univocal, and how that's the reason that passages seem to conflict with Jesus and what he was and said. But there were other areas. Hell became an area where I had
Mm.
been a firm believer in eternal conscious torment going into this period, and having, first thing I read was Fudge's book on hell.
Ah.
And I realized that eternal conscious torment was probably a Greek interpretation. Early Greek Christians brought it in. And yet, as I thought more about Fudge's interpretation, he thought it was more merciful, I guess, to think of annihilationism.
Right.
And yet, I remember one Sunday it was very controversial and I shouldn't have done it. But you know how in grade school they'd give you a ditto and it would give you four A, B, C, and D, and it would say which one doesn't belong, right? And three of
Mm.
them were the same and one stood out. And I did that on the second 45-minute service on a Sunday. I said, which of these doesn't seem to work for you? And I mentioned Nebuchadnezzar and the fiery furnace. And then I mentioned Nero wrapping Christians in wax and lighting his garden with them. And then I mentioned ISIS, who was doing it at the time. I was in the pulpit to people in that world who had, Nazarene in paint painted on their house. And then I said, Jesus. And I said, which one doesn't belong? And that didn't go over real well. Because, if you believe in eternal conscious torment or even annihilationism, here you're connecting Jesus with Isis, Nero, and Nebuchadnezzar. And part of that message, by the way, I'm giving you the Cliff's Notes, but part of that message was pointing out that Nero offered mercy to anyone who would bow the knee to him and say, Kaiser Kurios, Caesar's Lord. And in my world, that wasn't. Jesus would not allow that at the Bema Seat, because if you died before you prayed the prayer, you're not going to get another chance even at his Bema. And I asked the question, was Nero more merciful than our God? So yeah, it was. Now, did people start to think? Yeah, my Thursday night crowd, which had more time with me, I remember talking to him for a whole hour about hell and the different varieties of understanding it. And I asked for a partial vote before we started. And there were 16 out of 18 people who believed in eternal conscious torment. By the time I finished, and I used some of Fudge's work and I used some of my own, by the time I finished, only 3 still felt that way. And of those who lowered their hands, there was relief. They said, this has always bothered me. It's always bothered me. And I would dismiss it as, well, God is just. God knows better than we do. But that interpretation, and along with penal substitutionary atonement, those interpretations had always bothered a lot of people. And I think there are a lot of Christians out there right now who won't admit it, maybe, because they're not in that informal setting, but it still sticks in their craw. I came to develop, and I'm not a theologian, and I have a George MacDonald understanding of theologians. I think they've done more to harm the cause of Christ than they have in many ways. But I have a respect for a lot of theologians. I'm friends with many of them, mostly from Wheaton College. But I developed my own understanding of God, and I called it pinnacle theology. And it kept me sane. And pinnacle theology was basically, pinnacle means the best. And if there is a God and he's worthy of worship, he's going to be the best. And how is God described? Well, in the Bible, he's described as a creator. He's described when Israel was in a period of judges, he's a great judge. When Israel was in a period of kings, he's a great king. He's mostly described as a father. And I know what a great father is because I used to watch Andy Hardy on Sunday mornings, and Judge Hardy was a great father, and Andy Griffith was a great father. And he's also a great husband, right? And so in pinnacle theology, he's the great shepherd. We know what the great shepherd does. Jesus told us, right? The great shepherd does X and not Y. So trying to make him do Y conflicts with this understanding of God as the pinnacle, God as the best. And the best father or the best judge or the best king wouldn't act in a manner like that. One of the things that really moved me is, Christians will always say, God, they'll quote the psalmist, God is so far above us. And I get that. And if that's true, then God is much higher than we are, even more so than we are to our animals, to our dogs and cats. And I don't know if you've seen this show called The Dog Whisperer, but he takes abused animals. He takes these dogs that won't respond to anyone else, and they'll grit their teeth and they'll threaten other human beings because they've been beaten so bad. And the dog whisperer will take them, and after a period of time of loving them and working with them, they become the dog they always should have been. And I thought to myself, if a man could do this with a dog, can't God do this with his own creation?
Yeah, those are really good points. I laughed when you mentioned Fudge, because Fudge was a real turning point for me as well, reading him. And we both have a lot of the same heroes. George MacDonald is a big hero of mine. I have a number of rare editions. I started collecting his books many, many years ago when he wasn't very popular. So I got some pretty nice rare editions at a reasonable price. And his heart was the heart of Jesus. You really see that come through in his writings. And of course, he was a universalist, right?
Yeah.
And So I've ended up in that position through that same kind of journey that you're describing. So it's great.
Okay, gentlemen, we're getting short on time. As always, many more things that we could talk about, many questions to be asked. But John, I'll give you one last word here. Is there anything that you wanted to say before we finally draw a line under this one?
I've got a very Jeffersonian approach to flattery. He didn't like flattery, and this is going to seem like I'm buttering your muffin, but I want to say thank you to you guys. It's a thrill to be on this show because I've listened to you as I've been walking on this journey, and I found it to be like a home. It was introduced to me because I had just done a Church Without Walls where I mentioned my journey was like leaving Plato's cave, and somebody sent me your episode about Plato's cave, and I was like, wow, that's great. And that's how I started listening to you all. But you mentioned Rob Bell, Scott. I was told not to read certain people because they're heretics, and I found Rob Bell to be delightful. And his 4 episodes with his son on evolutionary psychology really, that's a real challenge. That's another episode you guys could do, is thinking the Bible is God's word opposed to what does evolutionary psychology and anthropology say about the development of man, which is something you touched on a few weeks ago, I think, Luke. They're very different stories. Sin and the fall and the development of man and human civilization over time. But I wanted to thank you guys because I know a lot of people who are on this journey really yearn to find a home where they feel seen and they feel heard. And certainly Recovering Evangelicals is one of those places, and I'm grateful for it. So I'm grateful that you had me on. It's a thrill for me. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Yeah. I appreciate
Well, we're
that.
grateful for you too, and for your willingness to be on, and for the work you're doing.
Right. Yes. And we're going to have some links in the show notes how people can get in contact with you, and links to your current podcast, Church Without Walls. And you also have another podcast, Sparrow's Call. I'll have links in there as well.
Yes. There's some great interviews that Christine and I did at Sparrow's Call. We interviewed a lot of people from BioLogos and other avenues that have written books, because Sparrow's Call was looking at those 2 areas where some people leave the faith because it's science denial. And then, Church Without Walls covers the other areas. But really, the science denial, there's a lot of reasons people leave the faith, but that's in the top 5 all the time.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, John. We really appreciated you giving us this time.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Talk to you later.
All right. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.